Please excuse the crudity of this stream. Hey, you, get your damn criticisms off this movie. Scripts? Where we're going, we don't need scripts.
Ba, 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 da, 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 ba, ba.
Is an in-depth story analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before watching and listening to this review. But I mean, you know, it's Back to the Future, so who hasn't seen this? Welcome everybody to the Superhero Rewind Unscripted podcast. I'm Captain Logan, and tonight, of course, we're doing a requested rewind, so it won't be a superhero movie. And I've got hanging out with me right next to me a special guest. I never do this for reviews. I haven't had a guest on an actual review since Vince and I did the 2004 Punisher 10 or 12 years ago.
What? Really?
Yeah, I know. Isn't that crazy? Well, because the show was always scripted. And then we did just a couple that weren't because I wanted to get Vince in on those. So we did that, and we did Punisher, whatever that other one was that was a reboot. Why can't I think of it right now? Punisher, it's not War Journal. What is that? I can't think of it. Anyway, but welcome Brandon to the show.
Thank you. I'm your friend in time.
Brandon is the biggest Back to the Future fan I know, and I've hardly ever done a Back to the Future video without Brandon here. And at the 11th hour, I thought it would be fun to invite Brandon, and so he
Appreciate it.
So I'm doing this as a regular show. I've got a lot of notes. I'm going to be going down my normal structure here, but when Brandon hears something that he's interested in jumping in and piggybacking off of or asking me anything, Brandon, feel free to weigh in and jump in at any time, sir.
I will say this, it feels a little bit bittersweet doing something, so Back to the Future oriented without Tim Lyons.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he did the reviews of the movies with us several years ago.
Yeah, we did commentaries on those.
So I'm thinking of him today.
Yeah, and I was definitely going to bring him up because every time I see in the Back to the Future movies Lion Estates, I'm always reminded of Tim Lyons. And I'm sure we brought that up when we did those commentaries with him. But, of course, naturally somebody has to say, let's go, Brandon.
Oh, wow.
Welcome, everybody, there in the comments, and thanks for watching after the fact. If you're doing that, quick plug, as I usually do at the beginning here for Patreon. If you'd like to become a Patreon producer for the show, for Superhero Rewind and Rewind Requested Rewind, you can go to patreon.com/geekvolution. The $10 tier gets you access to that. You can be in the Discord, and we have a lot of fun conversations about superhero movies there, amongst other things. You get your name read at the end of each show, which I'll be doing, of course, at the end of this one, and you can meet with me once a month. Sometimes we watch superhero movies, sometimes we just chat about some kind of superhero-related topic, and we've got a really cool, healthy group there that also helps me all the time come up with cool ideas for this show. So thanks so much to my Patreon producers. And now let's go ahead and get into this. So it is, of course, Brandon, a miracle that this movie got made, much less that it's as wonderful as it is and that it came together so nigh perfect. This is not the first or only time that somebody outside of a thing that Steven Spielberg wrote or directed said thank God for Steven Spielberg, but this is a kind of thank God for Steven Spielberg sort of moment. I watched So I always watch movies a couple of times for this show. I think I did 3 watches for this, even though I know this movie as well as I do, because there are not 1 but 2 commentaries on the Blu-rays and the old DVDs, with one with Gale and one with both Gale and Zemekis. And there's a really good Q&A. I just wanted to mention that in case some of you guys haven't looked at the special features with that, because some of the background that I'll be referencing as we're going through this will be from commentaries. I always at least watch a director commentary if there is one as I'm doing research for the movies that I'm reviewing. And anyway, there's a Q&A with the guy that put together the features for the old DVDs that's really good, but it's kind of weird that it's a commentary, because it isn't really a commentary. They're not watching the movie as it's playing. Have you watched that?
I don't recall this one.
What they do instead, it's the only thing close to a commentary you get with Zemekis. Gale couldn't get him to come back for the one that he did with one of the producers, I think.
I know I've watched him, but it's been forever.
But what they did was they had a panel. They had an audience, and they all watched the movie first, and then they had a conversation about it, and they just played. They just make it a commentary on the DVDs. So you have to watch the movie with that, and then it's not even the length of the movie. It cuts out like 20 minutes before the movie's over.
Oh,
it's really very strange. But I wanted to mention that because this is a movie that, first of all, I should mention, this was requested by Bag Studios, Bag to the Future. And Bag it requested all of the Star Wars prequels, which I've already knocked all of those out, and he did several at once when I still had the request here open and for Rewind. And I'll open that up again when I finish these. I've still got a few left, but not too many. I've knocked a lot of them out. And anyway, I wanted to go ahead and get to this one because he still had a few left on his list. And as soon as I saw that, I went, I mean, I love Back to the Future, and it's a lot of fun to talk about, but what do I have left to say that I've not said and that a million other people haven't already said? And I thought this was going to be a really difficult analysis, because I'm a little bit concerned about not just stating the obvious a lot and saying things everybody has thought of before. And there's no way around it. There's going to be some of that, because to do my due diligence and do a real story analysis, I'm going to have to tell you some things that you know. But hopefully I've come up with at least a few notions that that haven't brushed past your cranium yet. And it's really difficult to talk about this movie without just doing a lot of tidbits and trivia. Like, that's what's a lot of fun, with this movie, is every time you see it, you notice something new. We even had that with the commentaries, and like, this is probably the movie next to Batman '89 I've seen the most times, and maybe Ninja Turtles 1990 would be like third.
This is the one I've seen the most times. Like, it is hands down top of the list.
Most of us know this movie, especially if you're watching this line by line and shot by shot, so I'm not going to point out all of those cool details we didn't see the first 35 times around, and I am going to try to make this a real story analysis as much as possible. If I only mention stuff you never thought of, this would be a 6-minute review. Brandon, there was recently announced an animated series that's being developed for Netflix.
Yeah.
I'm, of course, kind of leery of that. This is one of those movies that I don't think ever needs to be remade. I don't even think it's impossible to do it. I just don't trust it, because so many remakes are terrible. And I think in order to do it right, and I assume that animated series is going to be just going forward and is not paving over anything. And hopefully it's,
according to what I've read, that seems likely.
Hopefully it's new characters and stuff. But I think a remake is set now with a Marty that goes back to the 90s, I think could work. If only, but its heart would have to be in the right place. And I also think it would have to be about something totally different. My worry would be you just tell the same story again, but you update it. Yeah. Something else has got to be at stake. It can't just be a kid who goes back in time to inspire confidence in his father again. Like, I would think you'd want to do something totally different, and my worry would be that's not what we would do. Real quick, I'll read this super chat from Brightburns, so that I'm not, an hour into the show before I do that, since we're kind of just in the introduction territory. Which one have you seen more, Back to the Future or Who Framed Roger Rabbit? And if Hollywood remade one, would you be more upset with Roger Rabbit? I think Roger Rabbit is harder because it's all about old Hollywood and animation. And again, I think you'd have to make it about something different, and I don't know what exactly that would be. Like, at the point you remake Roger Rabbit, what really is even the point of that? Like, that's a period piece. Do you update that somehow? I don't think anybody would even ever think to remake Roger Rabbit as much as making a sequel to it, and that I think is still plausible. But
what would that even be? I wonder.
What would it even be? Yeah. So certainly that I would be more leery of even than Back to the Future. But Back to the Future I've definitely seen more times than Roger Rabbit, even though I grew up with that a ton as well.
But isn't Roger Rabbit's like one of your favorite movies?
It is, but so is this, and you and I have also done a commentary on that together.
Yeah.
Anyway, so you see why Brandon's here. Brandon is the local late '80s Zemekis expert, is what we're gonna say.
So I wanted to touch on something really quick. You said you don't think it's impossible for those movies to get remade. Well, physically, yes, but intellectually, they have one of the hardest lockdowns on their property, the two Bobs.
No, I know. And what I mean is they would have to die before that happened.
Yeah.
Someday you might see that, because I don't know what their contracts would look like posthumously. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
if the studio would be allowed to make a thing after they're gone. But you're absolutely right. Like, and it's nice that that's ironclad, because if it wasn't, we probably would have seen that by now.
We definitely would have seen it by now. It's one of the hottest 80s properties there is.
This is a movie that no studio wanted to make, and it's one of those really ironic things where, like I said, it's crazy that it even happened, and especially as great as it is, there are scenes that were almost cut that would have almost ruined the movie. There were scenes that were almost left in that wouldn't, I think, ruin the movie, but would date it more, and I'll talk about some of those a little bit later. But I think the famous line at the end of the Johnny B. Good scene, I guess you guys aren't ready for that, but your kids are gonna love it, reads almost like a meta commentary on the movie itself. That like no studio wanted to make it, and while it was seen by kids and adults alike, it was kids that it had the greatest impact on and spoke to the most. So let's get into why I think the movie was as popular as it was in the day and has stood the test of time now. Also kind of ironic, this is a movie about time travel, and it is and it seems timeless. It's kind of cool how that works out. Especially for children, being so enamored with this, I think it's similar to Ghostbusters in that it's toyetic. And like Ghostbusters had more toys for kids, but it still has that kind of toy thing where when you're a kid and you watch this movie, you want to go play it in the backyard, pretend like you have a DeLorean, pretend like you got the flux capacitor, you're wearing the life preserver, whatever. It's got a cool, memorable car. Cars are very important in the 80s for children latching on to your material or having some sort of a vehicle. Your Star Wars, your Star Trek, but then even your Ghostbusters, your Back to the Future, anything that's got a cool car that you can imagine yourself driving around and saving the world in some way. Knight Rider, sure. And characters with quirky and unusual outfits. It's not a superhero movie, but kids are putting it in that category in the way they play with it, right? Also, it's got a catchy theme song. It's got original lingo that's fun to throw out to prove that you know the property, and again play with them on the playground. 1.21 gigawatts. You've got the lore. You've got easy rules to remember to make up stories around. Everything that cartoon shows used to catch kids' attention and sell toys are in this movie, and it's an accident that it's that way, in exactly the same way it was Ghostbusters, because it wasn't really trying all that hard to be accessible to children, but it worked that way. It is a case, of course, of art out of adversity. It's a minimalistic movie in its way, even though it is a blockbuster. Less is very much more with this. Budget and schedule limitations forced the producers to be creative and make a tighter and more intimate story than it was going to be. So originally there was supposed to be a climax at the end on a nuclear test site, and the location was too expensive, so the movie has to bookend at the town square and be about harnessing a lightning bolt. I mean, it changed the whole arc and structure of the movie. Like we had to go back to the beginning of the second act and change the setup, I would imagine, for how we're even going to get back to the future, right?
The setup and the entire design of the time machine itself, which started out as a fridge.
Yep. But the nuclear test site was actually still there all the way to past they're adding the DeLorean there. And how much less tight would the movie feel if you did that? If the whole thing wasn't about Hill Valley, if you had to get up and leave and go somewhere. Yeah, exactly. This is one of those weird cases where all the action takes place in this real small 1-block radius, and it actually serves the movie instead of hindering it. Surprisingly, you'd think that it would make it feel cheaper, but it makes the whole thing feel like a more intimate, character-driven story because of that. It's not just about like the big action set pieces, and I think if you had to leave Hill Valley and go there, it would feel like the set pieces were driving it more.
Well, the farthest that we really go is, a block past John F. Kennedy Drive.
That's right. And who the hell is John F. Kennedy? It was a product of its time and spoke to people of the 80s, so there's a lot of materialism in the movie, and in fact, there were reviews. This was a thing I didn't know before that second commentary. There were apparently reviews in England that complained that at the end of and nobody in America apparently said this, that Gale or Zemekis noticed, but there were critics in England that complained that the mark of success, according to this movie, is how much wealth you have and how how much stuff you have, because you get to the end of the movie, and now that George McFly has found his confidence and he and his wife actually get along, they are like wearing nicer clothes and they've got better furniture, and Marty has his truck, and it's really interesting. Like, it's very much a product of its time in that way. I don't think, me personally, I don't think that really hurts the movie. Pardon my computer making sounds. Because it is so much a product of its time, but I also think like I think this is a timeless movie that works almost as an 80s period piece, and looking at it within that lens, like I could see somebody saying, well, this dates it, because you wouldn't necessarily do that, and I think even now you might do that, but it's also the the lens that Marty has with his time, in the 80s being the present, so like it's through his POV. That's what he would want, and he's kind of being given everything he wants at the end as a reward for managing to solve this problem, even though he does get lucky some, and you can arguably George McFly does more than he does by the end, but isn't that kind of interesting that anybody had that complaint? I also think that it's just a good visual cue that, oh, these people are successful now. Like, I think there's a lot of other examples of materialism in the film. It isn't just that, but I always thought that was kind of a curious complaint.
So now they are successful, but they're still living in the same place.
Yeah, which I have questions about, but
But to some extent, doesn't that just say, not that they're maybe more successful or that wealth was the whole thing because they're still in the same house, but that just life was going better in general?
Yeah, or they've got different priorities.
Certainly.
Like they were living kind of more sad because they weren't happy with their life, and so like maybe they have. That's a good point. They could have almost precisely the same resources, at least until he becomes a successful novelist. But at the end, he's getting his first book, so we don't know how successful he's going to be.
So the book is more a product of the fact that he's not some, 80s consummate nerd.
Well, and that he's actually fulfilling his dreams now.
Yeah.
But anyway, but other interesting things about this movie being ahead of its time. So it speaks to people of the 80s, but it's also oddly pushing envelopes and challenging or predicting culture. So skateboarding was not big in the like Bart Simpson kind of way in 1985. In fact, Gale talks about how the studio executives thought it was kind of weird that they put skateboarding in the movie. Like they either predicted that or they had something to do with it getting popularized. Time travel was not a popular mainstream concept. Obviously, it was in some science fiction stuff, TOS, etc. But it wasn't a thing that you would expect regular audience goers to get enamored with, and this made it palatable and novel, especially because it was fun to see what could be changed with the past, with the sort of time travel rules that we're using here. It's somewhat opposite from the Time Machine, which they, H.G. Wells, which they got a lot of their ideas from, especially visually. And originally, their Time Machine was supposed to be a lot more like a Wells sort of time machine. But it was fun to see what could be changed rather than exploring paradoxes and dealing with loops like you usually would. And this, of course, became the gold standard for time travel because it has a clear set of rules and mostly follows them. One of the big reasons it holds up now is because it watches like a period piece, like I said, about a rose-tinted glasses 80s to some degree. Like, there is, you do see it's still like some kind of urban decay that we're dealing with in a lot of movies in the 80s, like RoboCop and stuff. This isn't putting a magnifying glass on that, but I like that it's kind of poking fun at it. So it's sort of like, this is a fun period to live in, but you're used to seeing dilapidated things, so we're gonna put that in the movie because it's realistic. But it's a heightened, exaggerated version of the 80s. Maybe not as much as it is the 50s. That is, of course, very rose-tinted glasses.
Definitely.
But I love the line that Marty has toward the end when he comes back to the present day and he says everything looks great. Everything looks terrible, but it looks great because he knows he's back home.
Yeah, he's fine. But that's even funnier because while he is back home, everything he knows, with small exception, is different.
For his own personal experience,
yes.
His home life. Yeah, exactly.
He would have no idea how his childhood went at this point.
It's timeless, though, because the story resonates in any time. Everyone is worried about becoming their parents, and that may not be and that they may not be good enough at their passions to try to make a career out of them. Everybody wonders what their parents were like when they were in high school or whatever age you are now. It's not a cookie cutter story invented to facilitate a gimmicky time travel plot like so many time travel plots. So often it's just about coming up with an excuse to go back in time and marvel at how impossible it is that you're there, and to kind of explore it like an open world video game scenario, but not actually have any kind of personal growth or self-discovery, which this movie, of course, has, both with both McFlys. I had a thought putting this together today, Brandon, that I don't think I'd ever had before. And then watch us go back to one of our old commentaries and we brought this up. But I don't remember ever thinking about this before. In that way, time travel facilitating a universal story, it's kind of like Star Trek 4. Okay. And that makes me wonder, how much did Back to the Future have to do with the success of Star Trek 4? Because that comes out in '86, the very year after this. Okay. And it's also accessible to general audiences. It was the highest grossing Star Trek movie until First Contact, even well above Wrath of Khan. Like, a lot of people went and saw that because it looked like fun and it didn't look like a Star Trek movie. It also takes place in the 80s, and it's also about time travel. It's Back to the Future if the 23rd century is 1985 and 1986 is 1955. And I wonder if that had anything to do with why that movie was so successful.
I mean, you make a good point and an interesting correlation. If I found that out to be true, I believe it.
I don't think there's any way to know for sure,
no.
but I'd love to see the alternate reality where somehow Star Trek 4 comes out, but Back to the Future bombs, or Back to the Future isn't made. I just kind of wonder about it. So another reason that I think the movie was popular in the first place is just that Huey Lewis and Michael J. Fox gave it credibility. There's lots of reasons to assume that if Stoltz had remained in the project, it wouldn't have been as successful. Partly because people might not have resonated, or his performance might not have resonated with people as much, but also just because he didn't have the star power that Fox had, and Zemekis and Gale were kind of surprised that helped at the box office, because at the time there was such a separation between television and film in the minds of Hollywood people and studio executives that it wouldn't even occur to you, oh yeah, if you had a TV star that was that popular, it might translate to box office sales, and it didn't always translate to box office sales.
Not only that about Stoltz though, but he also just didn't have the comedic chops for it. And you say
well, that's what I'm saying is that you don't know if his performance would have resonated with people.
Certainly, yeah. And that point, he also he just didn't seem to work well. I would imagine there's really proof that it just wouldn't have worked because
Right.
I've seen some of the footage.
So, but the point I'm trying to make is worked is a real like subjective kind of term, and like yes, when I'm doing analysis, I can talk about what I think works or doesn't work. You can't know what that would translate for box office sales. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, is it possible that that the script, the production values, and Christopher Lloyd's performance, and really the rest of the cast would have been enough that even if he's a weak link, it still was popular? I don't think with his performance, it's hard to say. I don't think it necessarily would have been the like long-lasting cultural phenomenon it was. It could have still had a huge opening weekend. Do you see what I'm saying? So yes, I don't think the movie works without him, but what does the box office look like? You can't know, and that's the point I'm making. It's a romantic comedy masquerading as a blockbuster. It feels huge in scope, but is really just about a boy inspiring his father to be a better man, and about two people that maybe shouldn't have been together in a relationship becoming the mature people they needed to be for that to look like fate wanted it, to look like a destined relationship. So this is why I'm saying, one of the reasons that it's popular and stands the test of time is it's a unique blockbuster that feels more action-driven than it is, and a unique rom-com that's not at all the standard formula because the romance isn't even with the main character, and in fact, it's arguably satirizing typical romance tropes. Once again, these guys did not set out to make the most accessible thing in the world. If they had, studios might have bit on it harder than they did, but it does end up being that because there's a world where this movie is made incorrectly and it looks like a chick flick. And there's a world where this movie is made incorrectly and the chick flick stuff isn't there enough, isn't pronounced enough, and it looks like a mindless action picture. It's a perfect balance. It, of course, created new archetypes with the eccentric scientist who pals around with a teenage kid more than half his age, which keeps coming, back constantly after this. It also is partly successful, I think, because it cuts out all the scenes that would have made it feel most dated now, particularly with modern sensibilities. And this is a point I may not have even thought to make 10 years ago. But as the world is changing so fast, and I'll get back to some of your super chats in a minute, guys. Thanks very much. Or possibly these are all one person, but I appreciate you. Gale and Zemekis' instincts were right in the things they cut. Now, I'll talk a little bit later about how, well, actually, I think I have notes about it now, so I'll just get to it. But anyway, there's a scene where Doc he's looking at his luggage from the future, and he opens up a Playboy and says, "Oh, the future is looking good now. That wouldn't play as well now." And Marty is concerned that if he feels his mom up in a car, he'll wind up gay. That's in a scene. Wouldn't play as well now, of course. And yes, there are other things that maybe like technically dated in that, and by the way, I'm not, of course, judging a movie by modern sensibilities, but I'm just saying that losing those probably helps it feel more timeless for more people.
Certainly.
The fact that it is at the end something of a typical damsel in distress sort of situation might turn off some kids growing up with it now. I don't know, but the fact that it's set in the 50s and it has those sensibilities in that moment, if anybody has any glimmer of historical understanding, then your perspective, then they should be able to handle that part of it. But it is interesting that the scenes that aren't necessary are still, if they were put back in the movie, would still kind of feel necessary because one of the things that this movie is wonderful at is, of course, never including anything that doesn't reveal something, and constantly having attention to detail and setup and payoff. So one thing in going back to the deleted scenes, which I hadn't done in a long time, Brandon, that I thought was fascinating was there is a setup and payoff for a prop within 2 deleted scenes that aren't in the movie.
Oh.
And it's crazy. So when Doc Brown opens that suitcase, and again, I'm dancing around just talking about interesting tidbits, but when Doc Brown opens that suitcase and learns what a hairdryer is, that establishes that prop. And
Certainly,
then,
yeah,
and
I remember that deleted scene.
And then later, there's an extended scene, and this part of it is deleted, where you've got Marty pretending to be Darth Vader from Planet Vulcan, pointing said hairdryer as a ray gun at George McFly. It's a setup and payoff within deleted scenes that are both deleted. And I think you can still see that hairdryer in the scene that we have, but he's like actually using it, and there's this, or pointing it at George, and George keeps like trying to push it away, so like they interact with it. Yeah, none of that needed to be there, but it's just interesting that the movie was still plotted that way. And I'll talk about some of this later, but there are a couple of moments where there's payoff for scenes that are not in the movie, and they still play fine without it, but once you know what it was, it's kind of interesting to see them now. It's, of course, a family picture with an edge to it. It's just risque enough to not feel like a lame kids movie or, like I said, a chick flick, since it's a romantic comedy. It takes huge risks that pay off. The story about a kid whose mother is infatuated with him was too taboo for Disney, so they wouldn't make it, while all the other studios thought the movie was too tame to do very well. But the fact that it does have that risque subject matter is one of the big reasons that it did as well as it did, and why it's memorable now. And finally, time travel, and I kind of touched on this a second ago, but time travel stories often don't resonate because they're standard technical problem plots, like a TNG episode that's not very character driven. You're trapped in the past, you find some way to get home. It's more about, like I said, that gimmick of exploring another time than anything, and it never feels like there's enough at stake because you know what's going to happen. We're going to figure out that device and we're going to get back home. This continues to resonate because it's not just about harnessing the lightning bolt, it's about making a lightning strike between Marty's parents too. It's a coming-of-age story through coming to know your father, and the two of them inadvertently help each other become better versions of themselves, though Marty does more for George, like I said earlier, certainly. And it's fun because you don't expect it to become a matchmaking plot. The science fiction takes a back seat to the romantic comedy, which you'd think would be boring, but it's just as effective. And now let's get into thematic stuff and what the movie's about. I got quite a bit here, so I will just blow through this.
Can I ask you
yes,
a question,
sir.
though? Do you think
Sure.
that,
And
that if this,
then I'll go ahead and knock these super chats out, actually, before I get to that. Go ahead.
if the writing in this movie had been as risque as some of the other studios wanted it to be, do you think it could have been just as good a movie? Or hold up as well?
Well, not if they tried to force anything into it. I mean, one of the reasons also that the movie's as successful as it is that once the studio starts or like allows him to make it, there's not very much monkeying that happens with it. There's one producer that wanted a couple of weird things, like the name of the movie changed and stuff like that, but by and large they kind of left him alone. And if that wasn't the case, and you hear the story all the time now, especially with these days with movies getting messed with in the editing room, and that's a thing that Zemekis talks about, that he claims that that's never happened to him with any of his movies, at least up through the time that commentary was made, which was like 2002. So in the last 20 years, it might be that he has had some of that. Okay, so themes with this film, of course, personal insecurity and its relationship to issues you have with your parents, not wanting to become your parents, hating things you don't like about yourself that you see in your parents, and mistakes they made that you try to avoid, but finding it difficult because the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So Marty is worried he's no good at rock and roll, just like his father is worried about writing science fiction. You'd think that those almost like duplicate scenes with precisely the same dialogue would seem redundant, and you wouldn't wouldn't buy that they both say that. You totally do within the context of this. Somehow it gets away with being like a little cartoony sometimes, I think, just because it's consistent in its heightened tone. And Marty doesn't even know his father ever had creative ambitions, so isn't it interesting that they both have those same lines of dialogue? And yet, they come to the same place, and Marty risks making the same mistake that his father did the first time around. And then it's about how you can't know what your parents used to be like, and they tend to pretend to be more perfect than they are to set a good example, and maybe because they're embarrassed or ashamed of childish behavior that they did that they hope you'll never engage in. When they should arguably, in my opinion anyway, be open and honest and help their children make better decisions. Wouldn't it be better if Lorraine said, oh yeah, here's all the mistakes I made that turned me into an alcoholic. You guys should avoid that. So don't date a kid that your father hits with a car because it's cliche and it's not a good foundation to set a relationship up with. Lorraine says a girl who calls a boy is asking for trouble, and I never sat in a parked car with a boy. That is a bold-faced lie, not just because of the thing that happened with Marty, because of course that hasn't happened yet. This is a time travel where you can change things, but she says in that scene that she's parked before, and you can, on a second viewing, maybe tell that she is, when she is making that lie, reliving a time that she had in a parked car with a boy.
Yep.
She thinks George, here's another example, she thinks George was bird watching when they met, but we find out he was actually watching her with binoculars through the window. That's, of course, not a thing he's ever going to tell his children about. And Brandon, I'm going to go to Star Trek 2 for a minute. I think this movie also kind of has the needs of the many versus the needs of the one thing.
Okay.
What we do despite rational thinking for our friends is part of what the movie is about. Marty ostensibly risks the whole space-time continuum in order to save his friend's life in telling him that he's going to get shot by Libyans. And ultimately, Doc Brown chooses to risk it too. And we'll talk about this later because I've always been conflicted on this point. Maybe because he knows it's not so risky since he dies at almost the exact moment Marty goes back in time and they've already irrevocably changed the future from that point forward. So like maybe that's the reason he says what the hell and decides that it's okay to go ahead and read that letter and save himself from the Libyans with the bulletproof vest, or it's because he was inspired and moved by Marty's friendship to listen to his friend and try to save himself. It's really hard to say, and I've always thought that that line at the end is a little bit sloppy. My wife and I had an argument about it the other day, and when we get to that point in bad stuff, and there will be very little in the way of bad stuff with this movie, I will give you her argument, and you'll have to tell me what you think about it, Brandon. And I'm glad you're here, by the way. Because there are a couple places where I'm actually talking to and arguing with you in my notes, and I actually have you here.
Oh.
So
Response is present.
So that'll be good. I forgot to read these super chats, so let me do that real quick. What are you gonna say?
Sure. The moment in the movie where Doc Brown realizes that the future's been changed, where Marty talks about how his dad just punched out Biff, and he's like, has your father ever done anything like that in the past? No, never.
Never.
Yeah. Yep. Like, and then he gets that look on his face like, well, we didn't end.
Maybe that has something to do with it too. But
Marty already hadn't ended now that he'd changed.
But what I was going to say is that, and we can argue about this later because we're going to bring this up again. But the problem with that as the motivation for his going ahead and looking at the letter later is it's just after that he impassionately tells Marty that he can't know too much about his future and rips up the letter. It's after that moment
because maybe he thinks they've changed too much already. I don't know.
No, I think that this is just all noodling that he does after the fact. Here's the thing. I guess we'll talk about this now for a second. We don't know how long it takes him to decide to paste the letter back together. And for the longest time, I didn't understand how he was even able to do that because, and this is so tiny and nitpicky, but I thought as a kid all growing up, that in the middle of we've talked about this, that in the middle of that storm, he throws all the pieces up in the air. Right. But he doesn't. He pockets them, which means it could be weeks, months, or years before he pastes them back together.
He could have done it before the initial time travel experiment that sent Marty back to the past. He could have waited till the night before he reveals the time.
He absolutely could have.
Marty.
Yep. Yep. So he had potentially 30 years or any amount of time in
That's true.
between, because he could have just saved them in a lockbox or something. You don't know. Hey, as long as he's got those pieces, he could have taken all that time to decide, and
Very
that
true.
makes it better.
It does.
Because he could, when he says, what the hell, I keep thinking it had to be that night. He could have decided that 30 years later. Brightburn's put in a $5 super chat and says, by the way, really quick, I saw a review for the film. Peggy Sue got married, and Ebert compared it to Back to the Future. Just an interesting fun fact that I've never seen that movie, so I don't know anything about the correlation between those. But thanks for the super chat, and maybe I'll try to take a look at that at some point. And another $5 super chat, but there's a question of whether Back to the Future worked despite Michael J. Fox. Yeah, I was saying that too, because don't forget, Mark Hamill was a TV star before Star Wars. Well, I mean, the fact that he is a TV star actually helped the movie before it hindered it, because Family Ties was really popular, and a lot of kids, no matter what the movie was about, it seems like we're going to go see that movie. So his being a TV star has nothing to. I mean, is not going to be a hindrance at all. But I still want to ask the question: is it possible that if somebody else plays that role, everything else is working so much like clockwork that a Marty McFly that's not as good as him couldn't tank it?
Yeah. It'd be an interesting. I'd like to go.
I think it's possible.
Back to the past to check that idea out.
Well, you'd want to go to like an alternate universe.
No, I'd go to the studio and I'd be like, "Hey, you really should check out this movie." I'd make a change. I'd be like, "Let me rewrite that for you."
Or you'd like have them keep Stoltz just to see if it was successful.
Right.
The movie is about what real love is, what a stable marriage is based on. I alluded to that earlier. Why, and this is a thing with this movie that I've always latched onto that I don't hear a lot of people talk about. I really think it's a little bit about literary cliches and making fun of them, and why literary cliches often don't make for the best foundation for a relationship. A woman falling for a man because she feels sorry for him is trite and easy. You see a lot of bad stories, bad movies that begin with that as the reason that a couple gets together, and it's based on something really shallow. And those Florence Nightingale relationships don't tend to work because, again, superficial. The knight in shining armor saving the damsel in distress is also a cliche, but it rings more true here because it proves to Lorraine that George can stand up, not just for her, but for himself. If that's all it was, here's the thing. She has to meet him before. If they had never met before and he just comes in and does that, and then they kind of walk off into the sunset together, it's terrible.
Right.
But at least they've met before, and at least there has been a little bit of talk on Marty's part, even to her, that maybe she should consider dating him. So like there's at least been some talk about that. It matters that it's Biff and not Marty that he punches out at the end. And a quick side note, in fact, have you ever thought about this? Marty's original plan would have been much clunkier and awkward for the future had it succeeded.
Oh.
If instead of if it worked exactly the way he'd planned it, and the whole thing in the car was a ruse, and he goes through with pretending to take advantage of her, and then George pulls him out, fake punches him, and then they ride off into the sunset together.
He could never look at his dad the same again.
Well, yeah, that's the first thing, is that his plan is put things perfectly exactly the way they were, and that's the smart thing to do for the sake of the space-time continuum, of course, but it ends up working out better for everybody involved because, you know, it's a feel-good movie and it's a happy ending, and he kind of gets rewarded at the end. But there's another component to this, too. If he'd gone back to the future and it had worked, I doubt they'd have named their kid Marty. The guy that tried to rape her in a car.
They would have remembered that more over. Oh my goodness.
And Lorraine might have always resented her son because he looks just like the high school bully that tried to take advantage of her in a car.
Oh goodness. I never considered
This
that.
has to work out exactly the way it does, or it's so much worse for Marty.
Can I, speaking of this though, can I go back to the beginning of the movie? So is Lorraine, would Biff have tried to get Lorraine in the car regardless of whether Marty was back there in the past? Or did Marty set that event into motion too? Because as Lorraine's drinking at the beginning, not only due to her, life that she didn't think she was going to have. She was the it girl in high school, right? But because Biff tried to get her.
So I never had that thought before. I think that's ambiguous. I think that could go either way.
I think it could too.
And I think that that makes it darker.
Yeah.
But that experience could have something to do with why she's as much of an alcoholic as she is.
Right.
And why her life goes south. Because maybe if that actually happened, I'd have to think about it and track it back. But if that actually happened, if that happened in the first timeline, then it could say something major about her lack of self-respect, where it's not just about marrying a guy that she doesn't respect, but maybe part of the reason she married him was because she thought that's the best she could do, because sadly a lot of women have that when that happens to them. I tend to think that Marty set those events in motion because she wouldn't have been in exactly that car in exactly that moment. But also, the first time around, Biff was still trying to get her to go to the dance with him. So how exactly did that shake out in the first timeline? You don't know.
And
that is a terrific point.
It's very possible that regardless of the fact of where it happened, exactly when it happened, when Marty went back, that it was still a thing that happened at around that time anyway. Because many of these events, while Marty got in the way of them, still unfolded as they should have.
Work out exactly the same way,
And there's
and I've got points about that. Like he invents rock and roll, but rock and roll would have been invented anyway.
Right. Yeah. So it's just another example of how well this movie puts these kind of ideas into play so seamlessly that you're not really.
Yeah.
It's taken us, how many times have we broken this movie out?
We've never talked about that.
We've come up with something new yet again.
Yeah. And this is why it's wonderful. It's as much fun to talk about as it is to watch. That's a terrific point. And we got to give that a little bit more thought. Write that one down, file it away.
All right.
There is a little bit of a destiny versus free will thing here, of course, and I think that's even maybe intentionally spelled out with the "destiny has brought me to you" line or density. I mean, has it? Like, it seems possible that George and Lorraine might never have been together, and in fact, if not for Marty's intervention, maybe they shouldn't have been. That's not a relationship that actually made any sense on paper until he became the best version of himself. But the universe does seem to be on Marty's side to some degree, on the other hand. He has quite a bit of luck in getting them together. Free will does seem to be mostly winning the argument. If it didn't, there is no movie. But destiny is there in the sense that whatever has happened is what is supposed to happen. It is, or at least from Doc's point of view, in trying to preserve the timeline. Because it happened already, that's what was supposed to happen.
To that point, it was the same moment that solidified it for Lorraine in both timelines. She says in the beginning, she said that she kissed him, and it was at that moment that she knew she was going to be with him for the rest of her life.
And that's a bad thing the first time around.
It's the bad thing, but it's the same kiss.
Yeah.
At the end, it's not how he defends her in the car. It's not how she's still, up until that point, enamored with Calvin Klein, but it's the kiss that does it again.
Obviously, looking outside the fiction, the real reason that happens is because it's clever and cute writing. But within the fiction, the question I have, and I'm probably reading too much into things, of course, as I have a tendency to do, the question is that the universe working toward entropy, where things are more or less going to work out the same, even if the details aren't exactly the same, or does Marty just get lucky?
I was going to mention that as well, because
is it just coincidence?
It's more of a recent thing where people have been looking at how in universe it works in the way people talk about the timeline self-correcting.
Yes.
No matter what happens, it still has to go towards this future, because even though you've gone back in time linearly from outside the universe, it still had to happen anyway.
But then, and I don't want to get too much into the sequels, of course, because we're looking at this as a standalone thing. But
which it was written as.
But when you get into Back to the Future 2 and you're able to create the the ruined, terrible present, it kind of breaks down at that point a little bit. That it's even possible to create a dystopia like that.
Going forward after the first movie, Doc's motivations for time travel completely change as well.
That's true.
Because he's willing to change the timeline innumerable times, and then also not change the timeline innumerable times.
A few more thematic things I want to mention real quick. It has the theme of social and also technological progress and change. A huge swath of farmland becomes retail businesses. A black janitor can be the mayor in the future, etc. It has the theme of blame the parents. Brandon, Lorraine's father, this is an important line, I think. He's an idiot, comes from upbringing. His parents are probably idiots too. And Lorraine is his daughter, so what does that say about him? That's what makes it interesting and fun to see Marty help improve his father's sense of self-worth. He's partially learned how not to be a pushover because he doesn't want to be his father, even though he has to admit that he has too much of his father in him. And maybe somewhat related to that, history repeats itself is a theme in the movie. And then last one, history repeats itself. So, symbols. I wanted to mention just a couple of things here. There's probably other symbolism we could go to, but I don't want to be here all day. Obviously, clocks. You can't not have watches and clocks is a big symbol in your time travel movie. Clocks running slow is interesting. The idea that, I think that might speak to the idea that the future and even the past in this universe is not set. People make decisions that decide what time looks like, as opposed to time itself being like set apart from the choices that we make. One of my favorite images in the movie, of course, is Doc Brown hanging from the clock as they are running out of time. And the thematic idea that time is running out while they're trying to manipulate time itself. And then manure is, of course, a symbol of karma. Bad things happen to people who do bad things.
Doc Brown hanging from the clock is even foreshadowed at the very beginning of the movie with the montage of clocks.
Yes,
you see
that's
Harold
right.
Lloyd hanging from the clock there in the pan through.
And if you know that movie, it's kind of a clear homage to Harold Lloyd at the end anyway. So like I could see people like picking up on that even without that clock. So it's kind of cool they put the clock there. And it was also kind of fortuitous, real quick, just going back to movie making stuff, the way the film was put together, the order scenes were shot in, because they almost didn't even have that opening scene. They shot that in reshoots. And because they had already made the whole movie, they knew what things to put there to set up things that would happen later. Because yes, a lot of things are in the script, but they're also changing some things as they go along. So Gale says in the commentary he did without Zemekis that if they had made that first for some reason, they wouldn't have thought to put the plutonium there. Like, all of that setup stuff there, it happens because they've already made the movie.
Gotcha.
As far as I understand it. So that's pretty cool. Okay, this is going to be another Cap's reading too far into things. He's BSing his way through a review. But this is a thing that I always thought growing up, and I want to throw it out because Gale claims in his commentary again that there's no special meaning behind 88 miles an hour, that it's just an easy number to remember. And I always thought there was thematic relevance to it, Brandon.
Okay.
My read on it was always 88 is two infinity symbols flipped upwards.
Okay.
Representing the infinite possibilities of going both forward and backward.
That's fascinating.
And that's why there's two of them. They didn't do it on
like
purpose, but I think it kind of sort of works. It at least half works.
Hey, I mean, even if you don't do things on purpose, that still can't. You still can find meaning in these things.
No, and I've always said that. I'm a firm believer in death of the author, and once you've made a thing, it exists on its own. But all I mean is that might be a little bit of a reach, even regardless of whether or not the guys intended that. I think it kind of works. I don't know.
Read into that as much as you want. I like.
Call me pretentious. I think it's interesting. Okay, I'll do a real quick character breakdown, but a lot of my analysis of of character motivation and stuff is going to be within the rest of my discussion, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But I always do a character breakdown based on the main idea that we're exploring. And in this case, it's insecurities informing identity and life choices. So to some degree, not with everybody, but especially with Marty and with George in the past, coming of age stuff. So Marty is afraid of, like we said earlier, becoming his father, has to teach his father to find confidence, and ultimately they both find it themselves. They're both coming of age, and they help each other, even though they're father and son, and it's backwards, which is really interesting. I also had this thought, this is just an aside, Brandon. Both McFlys have big dreams and ultimately kind of shoot for the moon with them, and they have the word fly in their name. So like, I don't know if we intentionally made it a name that reflects personality, but that's kind of in there. And then Marty at the end literally flies at the end. I mean, literally flies in the DeLorean.
Very true.
So that's kind of interesting. Doc Brown is an eccentric who has... I have no read on Brown, okay? Doc Brown is an eccentric who has money and brains but not much else. He's antisocial, doesn't have friends besides Marty, which is, kind of pathetic, really, and needs to feel a sense of accomplishment. A genius who doesn't know what to do with his know-how and intelligence. This is a thing, actually, Brandon, I don't think I'd thought of before, which is... Doc Brown grows up with a lot of money and not much else. And, like, being as brilliant as he is, or at least not much else in the social department, like, being as brilliant as he is, it's kind of dangerous to have the resources that he has. And I wonder if he could have accomplished some of the things he does if it wasn't for his family fortune.
Well, I mean, yes, but also keep in mind that it's largely believed that he burned his house down for the insurance money to fund his
I forgot about that
DeLorean
part
research.
of it. Yeah.
And also, think about this. He was actually...
But that was a big house, okay?
He was actually a rather mediocre scientist in his own life. It wasn't until he had some
that's
sort
true.
of savantism after he hits his head
Yeah.
on a porcelain
No,
toilet.
no, that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying he was successful before.
True.
I'm just saying that but he's ultimately brilliant because he invented time travel. So you
Indeed.
can't argue that he's brilliant. I didn't say he was
No,
successful.
That's very true.
Uh,
Do you think his brilliance was savantism?
I don't know. You be the judge. But anyway, so this is interesting. He has the same problem in 1955 in a way that George McFly does. He doesn't believe in himself. Marty has to help them both, somewhat despite himself, and inadvertently discover that their dreams are worthwhile. So with George, it's because he accidentally sets up a situation where he can take out the real bully, like we talked about earlier, and actually accomplish something. But with Doc Brown, it's because Marty brought back proof that he finally invents something that works. And this is another one of those kind of like weird accidental time loop things where Marty doesn't give him the confidence he needs to build the time machine the first time around, but he kind of does the second. Like Doc Brown has a speech at the end about how much richness Marty has brought to his life, but he winds up in exactly the same place and builds the time machine the same way, and they leap, and he goes back in time at precisely the same moment the second time around. So he's still it's still a loop. It still winds up in the same place, but he needs Marty to kind of teach him that, or does he? Or is he just a happier person? Like, I guess he doesn't need that, but he's just happier. But then isn't it interesting that he still burns his house down?
His motivations have completely changed, but his outcome is still very much the same, much like other aspects of this movie.
And the only way that, to something we were talking about earlier, and that you were talking about, the only way that you can explain after the timeline has been altered, and like you said, his motivations are kind of different, the only way you can explain the time machine going back in time at precisely the same second it did in the first timeline is moving toward entropy. The universe.
Yeah.
That's the only way you could explain it.
Yeah, I've thought about that as well. It happens, like, the reason that the DeLorean stalls out when he gets back is so that he can't get there before the Libyans have a chance to shoot at Doc.
Brightburns has another super chat, so I'll just read this real quick. Thanks, man. Another $5 super chat. You know, both the Back to the Future trilogy and the Spider-Man trilogy are pretty memeable, but Part 3 of Back to the Future is a better film 3. Yes, absolutely. And one of the better third movies in trilogies, because most of the time third movies end up being missteps for big franchise things. And the sequels with Back to the Future are not perfect, but 3 is a lot of people's favorite.
It definitely beats out number 2, but I'd say it's a closer distinction between 1 and 2 than it is between 2 and 3. So
Sure.
while 2 is the least of my favorites, or I said that wrong. It's closer between 1 and 3 than it is 2 and 3.
Yeah.
While 2 is
Yeah, I
the least
understand
of
what
my
you meant.
favorites, there's a wider gap there than my favorite, my second favorite, then 3.
So then I'll break down Biff Tannen real quick. He remains stagnant and a high school bully into middle age because George is still a pushover. So weirdly, they both hold each other back.
That's cool.
And they're both kind of two-dimensional in that way. In the altered future, he becomes either, Biff Tannen, a pushover himself, or is just a nice guy who stays around George because he respects him. Until, of course, in the sequel, we find out he's a cartoon character and just pretending to care about George when he's all in his growly voice and like, oh, this is what I'm really like, which is weird and an idea that does not mesh at all with the first movie. We don't know why he's the way he is, and there's even I'll mention this real quick, a mention from Gale, and I'd never thought about this, or I didn't know about this. Gale mentions in his commentary without Zemekis that there was with just the first movie, there was kind of some talk that maybe in the present day, Biff Tannen is supposed to be gay, and then we know that that's not the case because he has kids in the future.
It's true.
Unless he is gay and he still has kids in the future, which is possible. But I guess they thought about that. I guess they thought maybe he's gay. I don't know. Anyway, but we don't know why exactly. He's a little one-dimensional. We don't know why exactly Biff Tannen is the way he is until we get some hints of an unstable home life in the sequels. He's mostly a plot device, but an effective one, even though he's not sympathetic per se, given how emasculated and mousy he is at the end of the second 1985. I would assume he's overcompensating for insecurities of his own. The typical bully MO. You push people around to feel bigger because you feel small, and because all you have going for you is your size and ability to intimidate. And then Lorraine lets herself get into an incompatible relationship with a man she doesn't respect in the first timeline. We talked about that. And he takes the opportunity to become the kind of person she wants him to be, and maybe always thought he could be if he just applied himself. Hard to say if she ever had any kind of respect for him at all. And then George McFly is a pushover and a yes man because he doesn't believe in his own abilities and takes risks to get what he wants and of course doesn't take risks to get what he wants in the first timeline. He has the opportunity to for change that when someone he cares about is in danger. That's when that finally happens. Almost as if he just didn't notice those opportunities the first time around. And in a weird way, kind of has a superhero origin story.
Okay. How do you feel about the fact that the theme of if you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything?
Yeah.
It comes from Doc Brown first to Marty. Marty takes it with him to the past. Marty gives it to his father back then.
Yeah.
Comes back to the present. His father gives it back to him. It's like, I'm always telling you, son, if you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything. And it just kind of, that also made the rounds of the time.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I should have brought up that line. But of course, that's, very related to the confidence thing. But yeah, you're right. I kind of forgot that he says that at the end. Yeah. And that came from Doc Brown in the first place. Guys, we're going to go ahead and take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and get into good stuff and a tiny bit of bad stuff and questions.
Bad stuff.
So look forward to that. We'll see you in just a little bit. And we're back. I had my settings wrong, so we missed half the music there. And I don't know why I said 5 minutes, because that was only a 2.5 minute break. But anyway, we are back. Okay, Brandon, we're gonna get into a litany of things that I think work in the movie.
Good word.
Because with a film like this, you gotta risk just looking like you're gushing while you're doing your analysis, because there's a lot of stuff that is very effective with this movie. Incredible performances, goes without saying. Iconic score goes without saying. It's a movie where every element is firing on all cylinders to the point where it seems, pardon me, essential to the chemical makeup of movie making. This is one of those movies that it's hard to imagine didn't always exist somehow, like Star Wars or Gone with the Wind or Casablanca or Wizard of Oz. Quintessential not just for the sake of science fiction or comedy, but for film. If we gotta be pretentious film people and say film canon, this fits in that. Lloyd and Fox have some of the best on-screen friend chemistry in movies. They have a rhythm to their banter that's untrainable, and they invent these larger-than-life characters that they play exactly the same way from frame one, which I don't think you can underestimate how impressive and difficult that is. Like, when these kinds of characters are on TV, sometimes they take episodes or seasons for actors to find, and these guys figure them out right away and don't have to grow into them, which is amazing. I also love how convincing their friendship is with how little time Marty spends in 1955. That shouldn't work, but it does. I mean, like, it's only a couple of scenes, I think, after Marty says, hey, let's pal around together and you can show me 1955. And Doc is like, no, you've got to, basically stay secluded, before, like, Doc Brown says that he's going to miss him. Like, there's not that much time that passes, but you buy it. I think part of the reason you buy it, the movie cheats a little bit with this, but it manages it. It works. Like, I'm not even criticizing it for this. It helps that their 1985 friendship is already established. Mm-hmm. So we've spent a lot of time with these two characters, even though this version of Doc Brown hasn't spent that much time with Marty. I especially love the exchange, like I just mentioned, when Marty on the street with the DeLorean says, when Doc says, I'm really going to miss you, and Marty echoes that and says, I'm going to miss you. There's some good subtext there, because Marty is going to see him again immediately after he travels back, but Doc's going to get killed. So what he means is, you're about to die, and I'm going to miss you after that happens. I also never get tired of the two of them yelling dialogue. It's crazy just the amount of words they exchange where they're screaming at each other, and
I never really considered that, but yes.
Yeah, a lot of it, Marty! Like, a lot of it's just...
Great Scott!
And just like... talking to each other about logistics over a storm at the end. You'd think it would get really obnoxious, and somehow it doesn't. Somehow with them it works. This movie gets away with so much stuff that should be awful. Attention to detail, of course, particularly with the difference in how things work in 1955 that Marty wouldn't be familiar with. For example, George has to help him open a soda bottle because Marty is used to twist off. I love that little detail. There's a lot of things like that. If somebody went back to 1955 now, Brandon, he'd probably be confused that it's a bottle at all.
Perhaps.
It wouldn't even be like, how do you get this off? It'd be like, why is it like beer? Visual storytelling. Newspapers tell us things like Brown Mansion destroyed at the beginning, exposition in natural ways instead of forced dialogue, like the news report at the beginning about plutonium. And it's not all just in the opening scene, but there's a lot of really good examples there.
Have we
the
ever
box of
mentioned
plutonium underneath the table?
You just mentioned a lot of natural exposition. The same thing happens in Roger Rabbit. We get that montage with the newspaper about Eddie Valiant's brother.
Yep, that's how he shoots, and that's how he organizes scenes. Something new to discover on every viewing. Feels like a living and breathing world. I've made these points already. Ronald Reagan's name on a billboard before Doc doesn't believe Marty about Reagan being the president. That took me a lot of viewings before I noticed it.
I don't know where you're talking about that billboard, but now I'm gonna have to go look.
Yeah, so when we first see Marty walking the square during the Mr. Sandman sequence, I forget what it is, but there's a movie playing in the theater, and the marquee above it has Ronald Reagan's name.
Oh, okay.
World building 101, set up and payoff with locations and items that change or are different in the past. Twin Pines to Lone Pine Mall, of course. Clock Tower has no damage at first, then it's banged up at the end after what Doc does to it in 1955. Red Thomas on a park bench as a homeless man. Then we see his picture as the mayor trying to get reelected in 1955. Character writing 101, world building 101, character writing 101. Nothing is there that doesn't reveal something. Every element is there for a reason, tightly plotted, but also tightly characterized. Every character has a clear motivation, and our protagonists have clear opportunities for change, especially George McFly. And it's funny you mentioned Roger Rabbit, because I brought that up here too. This and Roger Rabbit are textbook examples of clearly plotted character arcs, and maybe the best movies I've seen to illustrate what that looks like in a simple way for screenwriting students. I have a whole breakdown in my Roger Rabbit rewind about just textbook opportunity for change. If you don't know what I mean when I say that, go back to that movie. And this one. Excellent pacing, command of storytelling. The third act always snuck up on me. I don't know if you have that, but I'm always kind of surprised when we're already there.
Really?
Like, it's such an economical kind of structure. That at the point where and this should be a problem where it's like, we haven't really spent that much time with Doc Brown and Marty McFly, but like I'm really buying their relationship. And then all of a sudden, we're already at the dance and we're already kind of in the third act. I think maybe one of the reasons it sneaks up on me too is because, and I'll talk about this later, but you kind of have almost like triple climaxes in this movie. So the place where you're technically in the third act, it almost feels like it ought to be earlier in the movie because there's so many climaxes. Because you have the dance, which is a climax to the conflict about getting the couple together. And then you have the climax on the street to make the lightning bolt happen, and then you have the climax at the end to save Doc Brown's life. Like it's a triple climax.
Wow.
You have clear opportunities for change, like I said earlier, that are sometimes taken and sometimes not, which makes it more believable and interesting. Goldie Wilson gives George an opportunity to stand up for himself in the diner, and he doesn't take it there. And I like that advice comes from the guy who will become the most ambitious man in town, and who isn't held back by society's attitudes toward his race, while George has every opportunity given him, but is held back by his own lack of belief in himself. Marty keeps giving him opportunities to be proactive with Lorraine, and he doesn't take them until he's worried about his own self-interest. He's bullied into it like he always is with Biff. Isn't that interesting? But he finally takes it at the end with Lorraine when she is in serious trouble. Marty finally takes the opportunity to take a risk and play music on stage, suggesting he might pursue that career in the future in the third act. So he sort of has a similar character arc that George has, but we don't put as fine a point on it. And that's actually kind of nice for the sequels, because he has not fully grown up in this movie, or at least you can argue that by the time you get to the second one. So with George, like, he's clearly going to start taking risks because of what he does with Lorraine at the end. And we know in the present that now he's written a novel. We don't know for sure.
Tales from Space.
Yes, we don't know for sure that Marty is going to do the same thing with music until you get to the second movie and you find out that he tried it and then he broke his hand in a car wreck because
Somebody called him chicken.
because he doesn't like when people call him chicken.
The redemption of George McFly does nothing to erase his Peeping Tom past.
No, it doesn't. That's true.
So he's still kind of a degenerate high school kid, if you will.
Well, same thing with Lorraine. I mean, she was already drinking. She was already parking with boys. Like,
well, that's true.
You don't know what she was doing with any of them.
Very true.
She might have lost her virginity already. You don't know. She probably did.
At that point, you would think she
probably did.
Yes.
I don't know, but she probably did. Structure 101. Clear first and second act plot points. Act 1, Marty winds up in the past after we establish his insecurities based on his parents' failures. Act 2, Marty has convinced George to take Lorraine to the dance, and he has a plan to get home. And then the climax, hurdles in the way of Marty is getting the DeLorean struck by lightning and getting in the way of George getting the girl. And also Doc Brown almost dies. We have, I also like, so just going through good stuff here, I like that the cast isn't too big. were really smart in having a small cast of well-developed characters. The action is cinematic but simple and doesn't go on forever. The skateboard chase is just exciting enough to be memorable, but it's like a 3 to 4 minute sequence. Like, it's really short. The action is always in service of the story. Again, it feels like a big action picture, but it isn't really. It kind of tricks you into feeling like it's a bigger film than it is. Doesn't feel like set pieces. I said that earlier.
We almost get more characters out of the same characters because Lorraine is categorically different after we've already met her.
That's a great point.
For the most of and like it's the same character, but it might as well be two characters, and then she's different at the very end. So that's a third character.
Yeah, and you get different performances from those actors too. I like that George McFly actually literally lives in a science fiction novel. And once he realizes that, he then pursues his dream. Like, he never finds out about the time travel, but he thinks an alien literally tells him to go out with Lorraine, so he thinks he actually does live in a science fiction world. He just doesn't know what kind yet. Maybe there's aliens in this world, but we'll never know that.
Maybe we should keep that one on the down low.
What do you mean?
The alien. That's basically what Marty tells him. After he's like,
"Oh yeah,
Darth Vader from the planet Vulcan came to me last night." Yeah. Let's not.
So we've also got product placement 101. And this is one that I think is really important because these days a lot of people like to, without looking at context or the reason that you're seeing brands in a movie, immediately go boo product placement. People don't want to ever see brands in things. And I go, when it's a cynical cash grab and it's clear that something is just plastered all over a movie because the producers or the studio got paid, and it's real blatant and in your face and taking over the movie, that's a problem. But we live in a world where we're surrounded by brands.
Yeah,
so
it grounds it in reality.
Yeah, so like to say you could never see a McDonald's is preposterous.
Right. He lives next to a Burger King.
In this case, the producers went after the brands that they did because they had logos that change over time. So like Coca-Cola might have paid them more, but that didn't have a logo that changed much. So they went to Pepsi because it had a drastic change. It's the same reason that they didn't go for, this is all stuff that Gail talks about, it's the same reason that they didn't go for Shell gas stations. They went for Texaco because it had a huge change. So yes, those companies benefited, but the people making the movie went to them, not vice versa.
It served to further the narrative in a way, instead of just being there for the sake of the money.
Yeah, and again, you need things that immediately speak to how different things have changed. And a lot of that is the stuff that's kind of fun to look for and point out. This is one of the most quotable movies of all time. It's up there with 89 and Star Wars and Ghostbusters. Also one of the most rewatchable. And like I said, I've seen this movie almost as much as 89. There's so much in these
movies. There's so much to unpack. There's so much to see. I still find, we talked about that earlier, we still find things, whether it be a little thing in the picture or a little thing in how things are said.
This movie has a lot of really good foreshadowing and not just setup and payoff. The Save the Clock Tower lady not only provides the solution to Marty getting back to the present with a lightning storm, but also establishes the idea of trying to preserve the timeline. She wants history preserved exactly as it was with the clock tower. We think it should be left exactly like it is. And then Marty goes back to the past, and Doc is telling him, "Don't change anything. We got to leave it exactly as it is." Again, great setup and payoff, and backwards, which makes it real fun and different. Things we see in the present day will pay off in the past instead of the other way around. Linearly, they inform the present day stuff, but they work in the way only flashbacks could otherwise. So the producers aren't missing any opportunities with this conceit. Uncle Joey likes being behind bars. You show Lorraine as tragically an alcoholic. Then in the past, you see her beginning to become an alcoholic. And then I never thought about this one until writing notes for this review, but Huey Lewis saying "you're too damned loud" to Marty, and then later, but in the past, Marty playing Johnny Be Good, and the crowd isn't ready for it because it's too damn loud.
Yeah.
And also because he's having convulsions on stage and knocking over amps. Another great example of setup and payoff is Marty telling Doc that George never stood up for himself before now, setting up the change in the timeline at the end. You brought that up. The movie is a perfectly woven tapestry of plot points and details. There are very few story conveniences, and the ones that are there, I'm weirdly buying in this context, and it's another like case by case sort of thing. I've got a couple that bother me, and I'll talk about them. But the most egregious comedic one, thankfully, was cut. You probably know about this, Brandon, where a kid comes to the door selling peanut brittle, and pushover George buys a whole case.
Oh yeah.
Just as he and Marty are having a conversation about his being a yes man. It's
Like,
way too easy.
Like, see, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, but what's weird is there's then a great payoff. I'm glad that scene's left out, but there's a great payoff for that left in the movie where George pours himself a bowl of peanut brittle at the table. That's in the movie. He's pouring peanut brittle. The reason it's peanut brittle is because he keeps buying cases of it from this kid and his dad that come by every year, and he can't say no to anybody. It would be fine if he did that and it wasn't during a conversation where Marty was saying, "Hey, Dad, you need to learn how to say no," and then 1 second later, the doorbell rings. Buy peanut brittle. Now we're in a sitcom. So I'm glad that was left out. The lightning strike might seem too convenient, but it's so well established at the beginning that it seems like a reasonable coincidence. And the universe is throwing Marty a bone while everything else is crashing down. And it's not too easy of a way out because there's so many hurdles in its way. Oddly, the most convenient or inconvenient thing that happens, contrived, regardless of how you look at it, is, and I don't like this one, is the DeLorean breaking down on him just when he's about to finally head for the lightning strike. Like, it's been fine all this time, and then now it breaks down, and then he just has to hit his head on the
It's foreshadowed
dashboard.
earlier when he first go back in time, and it stalls out, and he has to hide it behind the thing. But again, that speaks to the entropy. Again, the universe providing him with the answer, that's part of the entropy. The universe, because if he had immediately hit that when Doc got the time wrong, because maybe it was a slow clock, maybe it was another slow clock, because all of his clocks are 15 minutes slow.
But couldn't you just left all that out? Did you need, like we have enough hurdles already. Did you need the car to stall out?
No, you didn't.
At all?
At the height of the movie, it's just another thing. And
No,
it
is.
Oh my goodness!
But that's what I'm saying. But it's a little too easy because he's had so much luck on his side anyway that that's almost a bridge too far for me. There are some convenient bits also in the setup for Marty going back in time, but they play really naturally that most people wouldn't notice them, and they're believable enough contrivances. But I'll break this down because I think it's interesting. Doc puts in a date just to show Marty how to do that. If he had cleared it or never typed anything, Marty would never have wound up in the past. And he explains just before Marty goes back in time why he can't get back. If Doc Brown remembered to put the extra plutonium in the car, there would be no movie. But, I mean, he's eccentric and absent-minded, so we buy that he forgets to do that. And the Libyan showing up just before he can include the plutonium seems believable, even though it's kind of a contrived moment, because we just established that he stole from them. So the timing of all of this is a little easy, but the writing is meticulously giving us information just when we need it, so we don't think of any of that, about that. If you were there in the fiction, you might be like, some of this is a little easy. Plus, there's a tongue-in-cheekness to it that helps it get away with some of that cartoony logic. Incredible makeup and performances from young actors playing middle-aged. That was unheard of back then. That's not usually how you would do that. And there's kind of new strides in makeup that would be made just a couple years after that to make it easier in the sequels. But 1985 usually, or 83, 84 when they first start making this movie, usually you would have to cast different actors playing young, particularly because they're having to look middle-aged, not elderly. So it's a much more complicated, and Gail talks about this, it's a much more complicated application process because you don't cake the whole face on. Right. You leave some of it open. We have really good exposition in dialogue. That's also Dialogue 101. It's just writing 101 stuff. Lorraine's story about how she met George isn't boring. It's awkward and pathetic, and you feel for Marty that these are the parents he's stuck with, having no idea that everything they're talking about we're going to see when Marty goes to the past.
And
like the Enchantment Under the Sea dance.
That Marty's insistence that he doesn't take rejection well because his father doesn't take rejection well.
Yeah.
And that he's overcompensating for trying to get somewhere. Like when somebody calls him chicken and he's like, nah, I gotta fight you.
Yeah, but that's later. We don't get that one time in the first movie.
Well, that's true.
The chicken thing. That's added. It's a little tacked on. I think it overall kind of works, but there's a little bit of like, well, we already made a complete movie. I don't know where to go with this character after this. Wonderful atmosphere in the parking lot sequence. This is one of the things that most stuck with me when I was a kid. Feels like almost an E.T. kind of moment. There's a lot of mystery surrounding the DeLorean, and even if you know you're going into a time travel movie, it's easy to get sucked into the mood there. It's very self-aware of the quirks and idiosyncrasies that will seem dated in the future from the 80s. This is one of the things that feels really ahead of its time and progressive about this movie, because it points them out in the 50s. It's like, we know some of the things that are really silly in the 80s that someday we'll all look back on and go, how did we even do those things? The movie is aware of that stuff. Like with slang, with Heavy, the life preserver thing, the bizarre, overly futuristic design of the DeLorean, and that stuff makes it feel more timeless. That's the stuff that makes me say it feels like it could almost be a period piece made later but set in the 80s, because it feels like we're poking fun at the stuff that was normal then. We have really subtle, not flashy special effects. The lightning storm at the end is just a black sky that occasionally flashes with an animated effect. The fire trails still hold up and look really cool. The DeLorean flying at the end, I don't know how that still looks as good as it does.
Right?
37 years later or whatever. I like that as much fun and endearing as Doc Brown is, there are real-world consequences for his irresponsible behavior. He's killed in the first half hour of the movie because he stole from the Libyans. Like, he's a really endearing and likable character, but like when you start really thinking about him, he's nuts. He's a crazy person.
Unethical.
Yeah, he's actually kind of horrible.
Like, he doesn't want to kill the universe because he doesn't want to kill himself.
Yeah. Same thing with burning down his own mansion. I like the idea that his family fortune. Well, I said that. Maybe you're right, because I forgot that he burns down the mansion for the insurance money. Yeah. So I'll forget that point. Yeah. No, you're right about that. I just forgot about it. We have natural comedic situations that come out of believable reactions, so it makes the thing feel more real, even though the movie is not interested in realism. We have the life preserver business again. I can't give you a tab unless you pay for something. If you want a Pepsi, you're going to pay for it. And from a boy being hit on by his own mother in the past. I never forget she's his mom, and it never stops being amusingly awkward. I have so many good things, Brandon. It just keeps going.
It's a dissertation on good things.
It is. I might skip right. I'm just going to change the name of the show to that whenever we do, really good movies like this. And then sometimes I've done dissertations on bad things.
Certainly.
We have, because this was flipped on my last review, which is Power Rangers 2017. A lot of bad things. Good things took like 10 minutes. Cleverly paralleling scenes that work in this not altogether realistic world. The scene in the diner is the same as the scene in the house at the beginning. We kind of talked about that with another scene. I need time to retype it. You wouldn't want me to get kicked out of school. You wouldn't want me to get fired. Repeated dialogue. That carries over into the sequels, and it gets away with repeated scenes and motifs that plague formulaic sequels because it has already established that motif here, and because it's creative with it and it's about something. Again, history repeats itself. Yep. I just wrote that. Did you see that?
No, I didn't.
Were you reading my... See, that was my very next point.
No,
history repeats itself.
Of course it was.
We have subtle gags that... Would you like to read? Would you like to... We have...
Hey, great minds think alike.
No, look, I know it's Superhero Rewind Unscripted. Brandon will tell you I have a lot of notes, but I break away from them. We have subtle gags
unhinged.
That, like Doc Brown. We have subtle gags that create depth and richness even if you don't notice them, like Doc Brown talking about being an old man, but looking precisely the same.
I still have my hair.
I love Doc Brown's observations about the future. They're exaggerated, but sometimes there's truth to them. So there's no fallout from atomic wars, but there is truth to, of course your president is an actor. He has to look good on television. I like that Marty uses knowledge of what's going to happen in the future to get him home, and he wants to do the same thing to get Rich in Back to the Future 2 with the Almanac. Lloyd is so eccentric and theatrical, he's one of the few people in a film that can get away with looking and pointing directly into the camera, and it doesn't seem like a fourth wall break.
That's good.
He's elevating material that's already damn good in the first place. I like that at a glance, Doc can't even see the resemblance between Marty and George when he says maybe you were adopted. If you don't know them, they seem like opposites, and that's how Marty wants it. But like this is very believable. This is very realistic. The idea that if you don't know somebody's parents, you don't pick up on the subtle ways that they're the same, and that really bothers the kid. Like I've had this with my parents before, where somebody's like, "Oh, you're nothing like your mom." I'm like, "No, I think I'm a little bit like my mom." You know what I mean?
I have a lot of my mother's tendencies.
I like the initial mystery of why the photograph isn't fixed already when George decks out Biff. The stakes are still high, so it doesn't seem too easy, and the future is not saved with one punch.
Again, it's the kiss. They get to the kiss.
You're right. That's really important.
That's the nexus point.
He could easily do the right thing with the punch and then lose his nerve right after. Taking the opportunity for change again, writing 101, shouldn't be a light switch character reversal. It takes time. It takes a little bit more than that. And I like that Marty has done all he can, and it's up to his dad now. So he's just falling apart on stage, is totally helpless, can't do anything about it. It wouldn't work if this was only Marty's story, but it's arguably a dual protagonist film. I think there's actually different ways to look at this. Is the movie, because you do technically have character arcs actually for three characters. I don't think it's exactly Doc Brown's movie. He is more facilitating Marty's story, but Marty is weirdly facilitating George's story. And I've heard a lot of people who love this movie say it's not Marty's story, it's George McFly's story. It's more complicated than that. It is much closer to a dual protagonist thing, but if you wanted to make the case that basically Back to the Future, I think you could. Back to the Future 1 is about George McFly, 2 is about Marty McFly, 3 is about Doc Brown. I think you could easily make that. You could easily make that case.
Absolutely.
I see the Johnny B. Good scene as a reward for the audience for sticking around with the movie and for Marty keeping himself alive. They almost cut it, which is nuts.
Oh man!
They almost took it out.
That's a pivotal moment.
We already talked about the triple climax, so I'll skip that, but it does. It's kind of interesting. The movie gets away with so many things I usually resist. Like I said, even has the title at the end when Doc says they have to go back to the future, and it's great. I usually hate that.
It works so well
It works really well with this. It doesn't take itself too seriously. It's clever about it, so it's able to get away with that. I'm sorry, you were going to say something? You look like you were going to say something. And the flying car, it's such a surprise and a reward for the audience, once again, for staying with the film. And like we said, it still looks shockingly good. Okay, now I'm going to get to a few bad things. Most of this is nitpicky, and then I'll go through some questions, and I'll skip around a little bit. The fading, changing pictures, and disappearing limbs don't make much logical sense. Of course, they do serve as good visual clues to tell the audience what the stakes are. Some people find it too silly. That's a subjective line, I think. I like it as a storytelling mechanism. But if you think about it for 5 seconds, it kind of falls apart. The newspaper headlines in the sequels will get too convenient because there's always a good thing that happens on the exact same day as the bad thing that originally happened. Like Doc Brown commended instead of Doc Brown committed. So like that gets worse.
But again, it speaks to the entropy of them getting back to the same point.
I guess after a while that starts to feel pretty cop-outish to me. Lorraine sounds too much like her middle-aged counterpart. When Marty wakes up after he gets hit by the car just to throw the audience off, she's speaking in that same register and like deep in her throat, and like she's been, drinking and smoking too much. And then she quits doing that as soon as the light comes on.
Right.
There is one piece of connective tissue missing from the deleted scenes that maybe should be here. It's not a big deal, but I'll mention it. Most of the extra footage from the Darth Vader scene that we were talking about earlier is not necessary, doesn't need to be there. But in the very next scene, George says, "I overslept." And the reason he overslept is because Marty chloroformed him.
Oh,
And that's not in the movie anymore. So in the movie we
Yeah.
have, why did he oversleep? Did he just have like a lot of nightmares and dreams because of the Darth Vader thing?
and I do remember seeing the deleted scene where that happens, but
That's why he says
I
he
had
overslept.
always, up until that point, I had always just assumed that he overslept because he was awoke in the middle of the night and he had this thing go on and then he couldn't sleep.
I think it still
And then
works
he
fine.
finally did get to sleep and then he just slept through everything.
It works okay. I just wonder if maybe that should still be there.
And it's kind of dark, but at the same time, maybe it should.
It's so weird when in the
Let's
deleted
make that
scenes
cut.
when Marty and most of the deleted scenes are not is not great footage and is not remastered,
No,
so it would be
that's
really
true.
difficult to make that cut. But when
It'd still be fun.
but it's so weird when Marty runs outside and goes, "Hey Doc, that chloroform worked great." I'm kind of glad that's not in the movie. In a deleted scene, Doc doesn't have. This is another one of those. Doc doesn't have a permit for his equipment. He gives the cop a $50 bribe.
He bribes him.
I don't know that we have to have that, but the way it plays in the movie right now, it feels like he's about to pull out a permit. How does he have a permit? How did he forge something a cop would buy? Like, he would have to bribe him. And so knowing that that's what he did in the deleted scenes, it's easy to go, I'm sure he just bribed him. But if you don't know that, it looks like he pulls out a permit, and he can't possibly have one.
No.
Again, these are nitpicky.
No, but he also, in the scene that we get, he goes, of course I have a
He does,
permit.
but he pulls his wallet out, and then it cuts. We don't know what he pulled out.
But he sounds just sleazy enough in what he's saying as he says it.
If you didn't know that there was a deleted scene where he gave him a bribe, I don't know that you'd come up with he probably gave him a bribe.
And this is me speaking after the fact, but I feel like I knew
that's
that
what I'm
before
saying.
the fact, but I may not have.
Yeah, I never got that. So this is just a question. I guess we have questions later, but Lorraine maybe falls for George a little too quickly. It reads a little easy and maybe cliche, and it goes without saying, not very progressive, that she is immediately googly-eyed for him because he saved her when she had no interest in him before. I think that's better in execution, actually, in the movie than it is on paper. I think that's one place where they maybe should have developed that a little bit more than they did. And the place to develop it is not in that moment. It's find some excuse to give them a little bit more screen time earlier in the movie. That's kind of the problem with it.
When they say that she felt sorry for, when she says that she felt sorry for him, which is why she took him to the dance in the first place, I guess it's not necessarily that she fell for Marty because of his good looks, but that he ended up in the again. It's another. He was in the place that his father should have been. Was it the moment that caused that, or was it something else?
I'm not talking about Marty. I'm talking about George.
Right, I know, but I'm just saying, like, she didn't. She fell for him because she was sad that happened. Like, she felt sorry for him.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying I think at the end when George punches Biff out, she's maybe too quick to suddenly be really enamored with him.
I gotcha.
That has nothing to do with what you're talking about.
I gotcha. I'm with you.
Just the way it plays, it feels like this kind of automatic. And I don't mean to be hypocritical. We did say earlier it's good that they at least have met before, but I do wonder if maybe there should somehow be another scene or two between them earlier in the movie.
Well, she definitely just automatically sees him in a different light, and that that.
But
has something to
she
do with it, not
hardly saw
everything.
him at all before. That's the thing.
Exactly, yeah.
Could it have been any guy? That's the question.
That is the question.
Do you see what I'm saying? The effect of Marty's hand disappearing is not great. Everybody complains about that. Marty, we already talked about him hitting his head on the dash, and that he's fine with it, but I have issues with it. The ending is a cute joke that bookends the film nicely, but it doesn't make a lot of sense, of course, that Doc Brown cares about fixing things that haven't happened yet. I've never understood that, and going that we got to go fix your kids. It's just a thematic bookend, where like Marty has to save his parents. Now he's the dumb parent that has to go save his own kids. Okay. If Doc Brown isn't trying to change anything in the past, why is it okay or important to make things the way you want them to be in the future? It's not like anything was altered in the future by time travel. It's the way the first timeline ended up, or at least the one altered by Marty being in the 50s. I guess it's technically the second timeline. So why not just tell Marty to be careful, or his kids will end up doing stupid things in the future? The way he should solve that problem is just say, hey, Marty, you should probably go this way instead of this other way.
It also
and why not do that if he's okay with changing stuff in the future?
It also makes no real sense for Doc Brown to have come back to the exact moment after Marty gets back from the original time travel shenanigans. Why does he come back to that version of Hill
Why doesn't
Valley?
he at least let him have a hamburger first?
Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously I've got mostly nitpicks in questions, not a lot of broad category bad stuff. But there are a couple of things that I used to have issues with that I have sort of explanations for now, and wanted to kind of run by you, Brandon. So some of this is stuff that I figured out, and some of it is stuff that I haven't quite figured out. So I didn't understand originally why it was important that Marty invents rock and roll if the first timeline happened without him, but I'm realizing that that's kind of the big encapsulation of his character arc, right? Like, it's not about that history happening, it's about his justifying his choice of vocation and proving himself to himself that he should follow his dreams like his father didn't the first time around. I think that's what all that's supposed to be about.
Okay,
it's just kind of interesting the way Gale talks about it, because he's like, one of the big premises we started with was, let's have Marty McFly invent rock and roll. And I'm like, but you came up with a set of time travel rules where you can change things. So what about that? Rock and roll would have been invented anyway. So it's not about that happening. It's about what it says about where Marty's probably going to go now. So I think it's fine. I also didn't understand the whole Doc Brown putting the letter back together thing. We've already talked about that. And we touched on this, but let's get into it a little bit further now. So I always thought it was a cop-out at the end when Doc says, what the hell? We've kind of talked this over. Like I said, Sarah and I had a long conversation about this. I think if it's what she thinks it is, we just need a line about it at the end.
Okay.
Because Sarah's suggestion is that when let me just read this down because I'm forgetting exactly what it is. So Marty goes back in time, which means they're already in an altered future and a history that for them hasn't happened yet, so their decisions affect the linear timeline in the normal way, but there's a good chance that that's what's going on. It's more ambiguous than I want it to be, though, given that that's the main conflict between Marty and Doc, and it's a pretty heavy issue, given that Doc seems willing to die for the sake of preserving the timeline. And I always forget that Doc is watching the tape, which shows he's about to get gunned down, and keeps rewinding it, so he knows something about that, and is maybe not as worried about not knowing too much about his future so much as trying to make sure, this was Sarah's argument, he's trying to make sure that Marty doesn't think it's not going to matter if he messes up the timeline. So even if he's already decided, I'm going to save myself in the future, I don't want Marty to know that, because then he'll think we can change anything we want to. But my point is, the reason I can now change the future and it's fine for myself is because there's no time travel involved anymore. From the moment that Marty goes back in time, history was going to move forward, and people were going to change that's what I meant by that. People were going to change history the same way they always do, and just moving forward, right? But I guess we've already talked this out enough, because the idea that he had 30 years to decide kind of makes the whole thing fine and null and void to me.
He keeps saying, no one should know too much about their own
so it can't
destiny.
Be just what Sarah's talking about.
He says that right after he's watching. He starts to ask Marty a question about what he just watched on the TV about the Libyans, and he's like, "No, don't tell me. I don't need to know too much about my own future." Yeah. So he hasn't gotten there yet.
Yeah, and then because Sarah had me almost convinced about it until I watched the movie again today, and like we were. I don't mean to talk in circles, but like we were talking about earlier, when you get to the place where Doc Brown is shredding the letter and is just adamant that he not tell him anything. At that point, it's not about him wanting Marty not to change anything, because he's about to go back to the future. I mean, he's about to get in the DeLorean.
Yeah.
He can't have any more effect on the 50s.
Right. Yeah.
So it can't just be that.
And I always assumed, speaking of Doc Brown saving the letter, Doc Brown's a scientist, and he doesn't like to litter. He stuffed that letter in his pocket so
Yeah.
that he wasn't throwing trash out into it.
So just one or two more of these, and then I'll get into some questions. Would it have been... This is just a question, Brandon. Would it have been a worse ending? Well, this is part of what we were talking about a second ago.
Yes.
Would it have been a worse ending to let Marty warn Doc Brown like he said he was going to? He says, I can just go back early and warn him. What if he'd done that? Would that have been a worse ending than what they do, than the bulletproof vest?
Yes.
And what the hell?
Because ultimately it's more poignant when Doc lives, when he didn't. It was ambiguous in the past. I think that's the.
What do you mean?
Well, like, so if because Marty was originally only talking about, Marty gets back and he's like, well, hold on a second. Now I'm thinking two different things about this.
So what I'm saying is he goes back to 1985, and his plan originally was, I'm going to try to show up early and warn him.
Right.
But he still doesn't manage to get over there quick enough. And then Doc Brown gets shot, but it's okay because he's got the bulletproof vest, and he changed his mind for some reason, like we talked about not knowing too much about his own future,
Right.
and that's why he saved himself. And I've always, in like I said, it always felt a little bit like a cop-out. I'm liking it a little bit better after we're talking about how long he maybe had to make that decision. But would it be a better or worse ending if Marty simply gets there and is able to warn him and stop it? I'm not sure it's that different.
No, and it couldn't happen like that, because again, that's the timeline self-correcting itself, because he got there and he warned him. That's pre-Marty going back in the first place. There's no impetus for Marty to go back. No impetus for the whole movie to have happened. It would have erased it.
Oh, because he has to get shot.
He has to get shot and chased by the Libyans. And if Marty warns him that's going to happen, he never gets chased by the Libyans, and they never run into the photo hut.
Well, that's funny because Marty's not thinking about that because he tried to do that. He just luckily fails.
Right. So that's
okay.
DeLorean self-correcting.
Because the other, and this is, I'm saying this somewhat to be funny, but the other thing I was going to suggest, and I guess this can't work because the other Marty would probably stop and not go back to the future if he saw this happen. The other thing I was thinking was, what if, when Doc Brown wasn't looking in 1955, Marty just goes to a store and buys a gun with bullets in it that he could then throw to Doc Brown so that he could protect himself when his gun didn't work, and then or shoot the Libyan himself. He could go back and just shoot the Libyan.
But again, and yes, that is hilarious. But again, if you don't have the Libyans shoot Doc Brown and then chase after Marty.
So for the sake of what has to happen in the film for it to work, you're right. But why doesn't Marty think to do stuff like that?
Because he's not that kind of kid. He's not that guy. He's not thinking that way. That's Doc Brown's role to think that way, and Marty's just the teenager assistant.
But he did think to go back early, but not fast enough that he could go get a gun.
No, and
certainly.
Yes, and certainly didn't go back early enough, or something still would have gotten in the way. I think there's a Twilight Zone where a guy goes back to kill Hitler, right? But every time he gets that shot, something happens.
Yeah,
and he's not able to do it. And it's similar here.
It's hard to say if that's exactly what's happening here, or if it's just luck. You know what I mean?
It's luck of the writing, but I love that it works that way.
Okay, so I'm going to go through some questions. I'm going to read these down quickly. Some of these are just fun. Some of these are slight criticisms. Is George McFly actually a slacker? He seems real studious to me, but maybe he's spending so much of his time doing Biff's homework that Strickland doesn't realize he has work ethic.
As presumably he passed high school. We don't know if he went to college.
Yeah.
So maybe he is a slacker. He didn't amount to much.
This is a big one. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm gonna ask you a trivia question.
Okay.
What number of child is Marty? He has how many older siblings?
He has two other siblings.
Yes.
Is he the middle child? Or is it? Wait,
no.
He's
the youngest. Is he not? Yeah, he doesn't have a younger sibling.
Yeah, they're two older than him.
So riddle me this. Are you ready? At the end of the movie, You know where I'm going with this, right?
No.
Okay. At the end of the movie, Lorraine says, Marty, that's a nice name. Why didn't they name their first son
first
that?
kid, Marty. Oh.
Right?
Yeah. He should be the oldest.
When does Doc Brown ever find out about the destruction Marty causes in his lab because of the blown out amp? Does he ever go back to his lab before he shows Marty the DeLorean? I don't think that he does. And then he dies when Marty goes back in time. And then he never goes back to that lab in the sequels. So it's possible that he never finds out about it.
He's in the lab in Hell Valley in the alternate 1985. And he just assumes that the destruction... No, like,
he
this
just
is the
assumes
whole
that
thing.
it's part
he
of
assumes
the...
that the destruction of
So
the,
you
of
thought
the
about
lab was because of Hill Valley, but it's because even in that time frame, Marty had just been there.
It's part of the dystopia.
It's part of the dystopia.
But that's the first time he ever sees it.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Why does the amplifier
I thought
overload?
About this. He says don't hook up to the amplifier.
It might overload.
Yeah.
Why? What did he do to it?
I just think he overpowered it.
Okay.
But there's an Easter egg in there where Marty's turning up the potentiometers, the big potentiometers, and it says CRM like 115, which is a callback to a Stanley Kubrick number.
Yeah.
I love that scene.
How does Marty already know? See, now we're just doing the tidbit thing. How does Marty already know he's going to be late for school? Or how doesn't he already know he's going to be late for school when he goes to Doc Brown's house? Yes, the clocks are 25 minutes slow, but what time was it when he got there? That's always driven me crazy.
He probably just didn't realize, I guess. But yeah, no, he would have known he was running behind.
Did he wake up late and got his breakfast too late? Would Doc Brown have still blown up his mansion after his experience in 1955 with Marty? That's always been a question I've had.
Well, he apparently did still.
I guess just so he can fund his stuff.
Yeah.
If the pinheads are too loud, why can't they just turn down their amps? Huey Lewis.
Because Marty's unwilling to compromise. Again, he's overcompensating.
Doesn't every car have a blind spot?
Pretty much.
Why does Marty seem so impressed by how tall Biff is in 1955? He tries to stand up to Biff, and then he backs off when Biff intimidates him with his size, but Marty knows Biff in 1985 and how big he is.
That's a good question.
So Biff stands up like this, he's like, oh, and then he backs off, and he starts being really polite, and I'm like, you know how big he is. You just had a scene with him. Right?
That's true. That's true. I mean, he's not that much hunched over because he's still this kind of larger than life buffoon.
And he's not hunched over. I looked for that in the car crash scene.
Not until the new 1985. That's when he's like, got everything waxed up for you.
Right. What kind of, again, some of this is nitpicky, but it's fun.
Fun.
What kind of calls does a 24-hour science service get?
You know, I always thought that was a little bit of wishful thinking on the part of Doc Brown.
Yeah, he probably doesn't get any calls, right?
I would imagine that he doesn't. I mean, he's got some sort of business, but I've always imagined that it was just failing all the time.
So they're out in the parking lot at Twin Pines Mall, right? And Doc says, never mind that now, not now. And then later we hear that on the videotape. But Marty has clearly not pressed the record button on the camcorder yet when he says it. So how did that wind up on that tape? I checked it. His finger, even if he's recording down here, his finger's nowhere near that button. And then he picks it up, and right after Doc has that line, he starts,
Whoops.
That's how specific I'm getting today, folks. How does it's surprising that a way is not found to bring back that giant remote control for the DeLorean again? How do we never see that again?
I know, that was amazing.
You think at some point in the sequels there'd be like a big reveal where it's like, and Doc's been controlling it the whole time.
Through time.
Is Marty an idiot? And when you get to 3, we know he is because of schematic.
I knew you were going to. I was like, well, I can't say schematic.
I can't get through a Back to the Future video without schematic. Schematic. The DeLorean is obviously cold and not hot when Einstein shows back up in the parking lot. But he's like, is it hot? You're an idiot. It's obviously cold. Why does Doc Brown admit to stealing from the Libyans into the camera? For a second, it looks like he doesn't want any evidence of it. He does this, like, stop talking about that,
yeah.
and then he starts talking directly into the camera and explaining what he did.
Posterity reasons, and he's trying to be all scientific.
I get that he's
about
eccentric
it,
and crazy, but that seems like a contradiction in the moment with his character.
Well,
It's like, don't talk about that. But since you asked,
he forgets, that he's posteriorizing this, for lack of a better term, making a posterity post basically, and he's just talking to a friend at that point.
So here's a question. We know from the parking lot scene that Doc Brown is planning on going to the future with his time machine.
Yes.
He says that's where he wants to go. Pays off at the end when he actually goes there, right?
Yeah.
Why doesn't Marty tell the 1955 Doc that his 1985 self is planning to go to the future to find out what he's like there, when he says no one should know too much about his own future? It would be an argument for preventing his own death.
It would be an argument for preventing the invention of the time machine at all. To be honest with you,
That's
because
true,
you can't
too.
go to the future, and you can't, and he's worried about changing the present, which is Marty's past.
That's
then
true,
you
too.
can't go anywhere.
But if I were him, I'd be like, you you might not feel this way now, but in the 80s, your whole thing is going to be going to the future and finding out about your own future.
Yeah.
Like he says, I want to know what I'm like as an old man. How would you hook up that video camera to a TV from the 50s that wouldn't have anything but coax?
I mean, it wouldn't even have that.
Would it not? No, it wouldn't, would it?
No, it had just the 2 antenna inputs.
Yeah.
That's still possible to do. You
Oh,
could
okay.
rig it. You could rig like it was still an analog signal, right? We weren't doing the digital signals yet, so you could still. You're not going to get all the channels out of it, but you could definitely rig it to operate.
Apparently, it took them hours to get it to hook up to that TV on set.
Well, there again, that sounds like they were using actual equipment, and they did it.
What gave Goldie the idea to run for mayor in the original timeline? Is he mayor earlier and with extra terms now?
Interesting.
Because now it might be the interesting thing we keep talking about, where something else that year made him think of it. But he's like, I could run for mayor, and then I'm like, well, maybe he ran earlier and he was like mayor longer. Although with the red thing, I guess not. But I don't know. It's a thing I thought of.
Interesting.
Is Marty aware of his other aunts and uncles? Because he looks almost like he doesn't recognize them and didn't realize that they existed. Like when he goes back to the 50s and he's having dinner with them
been
all.
in jail.
Yeah, but
Never made parole.
other than him, there's just something about the acting in that scene where I'm like, did you know you had aunts and uncles?
Or his grandparents, for that matter.
Yeah, right. How does Doc know about the photograph conceit? He knows Marty's brother is going to start disappearing before he does. He says, let me see that picture of your brother. He's like, he knows that's going to happen. And how does he know the kids will disappear slowly from the future rather than just poof out of existence all at once?
Yeah, he does say.
He's a bit of an exposition
just
head.
as I suspected.
Yeah.
Because he gets that idea.
But how does he
gets
know
that?
that?
Hair in the moment is what I always went with.
He's right about all of it. I don't know how he knows that. So I'm gonna be mean to Brandon for a minute. Brandon thinks that the mind control device partially works. Does it? Does the mind control device actually work?
So it does.
We've argued about this for years.
And I was thinking about this earlier in this very video, and I was like, so this is what speaks to my mediocre scientist comment, is because some of this, Doc Brown thinks that another one of his inventions has failed. He previously stated that this was like the first invention that actually worked, when the time travel experiment with Einstein actually works. He makes some allusion to like, it actually works. He says, he goes, it actually worked, because he always thought his inventions were that they didn't work. So what he doesn't realizing
that doesn't mean that worked, though.
What he doesn't realize is that he's actually pulling things from Marty's head that are allusions to things that happened in the movie.
That's what you think?
No.
I don't buy it.
He says you're with the Coast Guard Youth Auxiliary.
Right, which he could get from the outfit he's wearing in the exact same way that the guy at the like he's just guessing at stuff, and he's wrong about everything else.
There's more to it than that. I'll have to rewatch that scene again. But
I've heard your arguments. I've never bought it. Like we've argued about this for years. I think you're stretching so hard with that. I've never bought it. John Kelling, $5 super chat, says he's at the LAX airport right now, flying back to Orlando. Just wanted to say hi. Love you guys. I would shoot Hitler.
Okay.
See,
for-
but at what
just-
cost? Like, you don't know what the future would look like after that, and if you would make things better or worse having done
That's
that.
true.
And what about all the people that were born afterwards that wouldn't be, and that sort of thing? So, like, yes, you're stopping atrocity, and that's good. And obviously, you know, you wish you could save everybody in the Holocaust, but then is it fair to everybody that's born after that wouldn't be, or whatever? You know what
Is
I
it
mean?
fair to
So
yourself?
that
You-
makes
you
it
don't-
very difficult for me to decide what to do in a situation like that.
And you don't.
I feel like I would
actually
leave well
know-
enough alone. Like
don't-
Doc Brown, I don't want the responsibility, Brandon.
Yeah, but you wouldn't actually know if you're removing yourself from existence at that point because someone else came along and then you're not you. So you could be erasing yourself by saving millions of lives in the Holocaust too.
That's true. People in the comments agree with you on the mind control on the mind reading device.
Team mind
Why
control.
why does George pronounce it planets? Especially because later he says planets like a normal person.
I never noticed that one.
Yeah, he goes. I'm writing stories about aliens that come, extraterrestrials that come to Earth from other planets, and then later he says planets, like a regular person. Why does the model need to be electrified to make the point of what they're trying to accomplish? You and I have always talked about this because it's really funny.
I mean,
We're
Doc Brown likes to overdo it.
I feel like the point of it in the film is so that we can set something on fire and so that there's a bad omen. I hadn't really thought about that so much before, but like the simulation doesn't actually work. So they're like, oh, I hope this works out better than what we just
Right.
like it's a bad omen. Like this might not work out. So I guess that's why. But like you didn't have to actually electrocute it. So I thought about this just because of the deleted scene where we talked about this a little bit. There's this deleted scene where Marty is worried that if he that if he messes with his mom in the car, he's going to wind up gay somehow, which is so weird, and I'm glad that didn't actually make it into the movie.
It's more edible than what we already get.
But based on that, couldn't Marty repel his mother just by telling her he's gay? Couldn't he
Ooh.
just be like, "Oh, I'm gay. I'm not interested in women"?
The time frame that I think we touched on this once before. The time frame in which he is, that's more taboo.
Who
than-
cares?
Well,
But he's. Well, why would he be worried about his reputation? As long as he doesn't think somebody's going to come after him with pitchforks, why not say that?
I mean, if
He
he's
shouldn't
worried
be
about
making
becoming
relationships-
gay, he's going to be worried about saying it. He doesn't want to go anywhere near it at that point.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. If he's that opposed to the idea, like if he's that
But
skewed on
but all
his
I'm saying
views,
is it would be a potential solution.
potentially.
Does it ever occur to George and Lorraine that their son Marty looks and sounds exactly like the guy who helped them to get together
It
that
can't have.
Lorraine was obsessed with?
And people have asked this question. I've seen it on boards and stuff all the time. Like, why don't they? Why don't they understand this? Has enough time passed? You know, I don't believe it. Especially because that kid had that high school kid had some weird knowledge of their own kid gonna light
Yeah.
the carpet on fire.
Yeah. 15 years later, you'd be like, wait a minute, he looks a lot like that, right?
Yeah.
John Kelling, $2 super chat. No matter the cost, no sacrifice, no victory. I'm not sure why he wrote that, but thanks, John Kelling. And then Billy the Kid Lawrence, have fun on your airplane. $10 super chat. Pretty sad that while there are many product placements in these Back to the Future movies, including a blatant Burger King in the opening of the first film, there's not a single White Castle. That's true, but it's probably because there's this whole running White Castle thing on the channel. I don't know if you know about the White Castle thing. I'm not going to get into it again, but people love to make super chats about White Castle. Thanks very much for the
I
super
don't
chat.
like White Castle.
I can't get into it right now. But people keep talking about White Castle, and then I finally went there and I did a video about it, and I too did not like White Castle. I thought it was very bland. But anyway, yeah, I would assume that the reason is because they didn't think of it, or because White Castle's logo never changed. I mean, they have exactly the same logo, I think, forever. Why does Marty's brother still live at home at the end when he has a great office
I wondered
job?
the same thing. I almost
Or
brought it up earlier.
Is he just having breakfast with his family that morning? It is
I
ambiguous.
can't tell.
Yeah, it's impossible to tell.
I thought
but
about this earlier in
he
this
shouldn't be
video,
living there.
and I was like, should I bring this up or should I wait for it later? Here it is. It is ambiguous at best. Well, I always wear a suit to the office. You know that.
So George just became a novelist. We don't know if he's even going to be able to make a living with it. He just got his first book published. What business was he in before he did that? Or what business is he in now, I wonder? There's no talk about it.
He was a Poindexter, but like, hey, he's got the pocket protector and everything, and it just seems like he
doesn't at the end, though.
The office. No, but in the beginning.
No, I know, but I'm saying but we don't know that he has the same job at the end that he did at the beginning. I'm saying, what job is he doing?
I'm going to say I think he was like a draftsman or a numbers cruncher.
But do you think it's the same in both timelines?
No.
Well, that's what I'm saying. What is he doing at the end?
The second timeline, he's coming back from playing golf. He's an executive at that point.
Well, that's what I'm asking. But you're giving me the answer to the beginning. I'm talking about the end. What job is he doing
some sort
before
of
he gets
position.
his book published? Why are you talking about the pocket protector?
I thought you meant from the beginning.
No.
No, I'm with you now.
I'm saying he just got published. What was he doing for a living before he got published? That's what I'm asking.
He probably owned a business in town, I'm guessing.
Okay, so that's going to be it for me. Let's go ahead and we've only got a couple tweet length reviews. Actually, I'm going to check real quick and see if any others came in, because I forgot to send these out to the regular patrons earlier, so I went ahead and did that. Okay, I've got one from Stone Gasman. I'll go ahead and read this, and then I'll read the other ones I've got, and then I'll go ahead and give my rating. Actually, I'll just give it now. It's a 4. So, Stone Gasman, don't care what the Academy says. This was hands down the finest film of 1985, a rollicking time travel adventure comedy, which became the biggest smash of its time, spawned 2 solid sequels, and hopefully no more. 4 out of 4. Wonderful review, Stone Gasman. Thanks, buddy. Subject 879. This is John. John just did the 24-hour Smallville stream with me. He was my co-host for that. Thanks a bunch, John. He says, a fantastic movie and one of the first movies to get me into sci-fi with a wonderful script and great performances. 4 out of 5. And finally, Tom says, one of the founding films of what it means to be a modern time travel movie. What it lacks in story, it makes up for in acting and visuals. 3.5 out of 4. And like I said, for all the positive reasons I gave earlier, it's a near perfect film. Besides the fact that I had little nitpicky quibbles that were fun to talk about, yes, this is clearly a 4 for me as well. And I'm sure Brandon would also give it a 4.
Oh, yeah, the highest marks for this movie. I always love, so this movie cemented the backlot at Universal Studios for me, and I absolutely love finding it in other movies when they use it. Like, Bruce
why did they
Almighty.
Cement the backlot?
Huh?
Why is it all cement now? Why would you do that?
I mean, you've seen it's I like in Bruce Almighty. There's a scene on the set in that courtyard in front of the clock tower, and other things, where stuff has been filmed there. I just love it.
Robert Wild says, that never bothered me. They knew him for like a week, and that was decades ago. Yeah, maybe. But I feel like that
it's the
that
most
face would stick with you.
Pivotal time in their lives.
Yeah.
You don't forget how you met, even if you forget the date of when you met.
Okay, so thanks a lot, everybody, for being here. I'm going to go ahead and call it a night because we're well past 2 hours. As always, I want to say thanks to the patrons for helping make our channel and these shows possible, and especially our Superhero Rewind producers. Once again, if you'd like to become a producer and get all those wonderful perks and hang out with me once a month watching superhero movies and talking about superhero stuff, you can go to patreon.com/geekvolution, and it's at the $10 tier. And I'm going to say thanks to all of our $10 patrons and above right now, including Bill Mills, Blake, Chewbacca's Lover, David Crabtree, Elliot Slater, Gooster123, Hayden Spring, Hot Soup, Jeff Niederhofer, Joe Turner, Joe Gira, Joshua Gilisano, Matt Bat68, Michael Martin, Stone Gasman, we just heard from him, Super Billy, The Amalgamation, Thomas Edshill, we just heard from him as well, Adam March, Checkers, The Inventor, Damon Begay, Jacob Schneider, Bag Studios, who requested tonight's movie. Thanks a lot, Bag. Kareem Roberts, Matthew Brody, Michael Austin, Gulick, Miguel Rodriguez, Unknown Passenger, Wendell Jones, and Zach. You guys are wonderful, and thanks again to all the other patrons as well. Next week, I'm not going to do a review because DJ and I are continuing our series that we started a few months ago on music and superhero movies and television, and we're going to be counting down our top 10 favorite songs for animated superhero movie TV shows, which I'm very excited to do. And we're going to be doing that on Tuesday next week instead of Monday. So Monday night, we're going to have a different video for you, probably a comic review. Not sure what that's going to be yet. But Tuesday, which is usually one of our two Captain Logan show nights, we're going to do a rewind next week. So look forward to that. And then the week after, I will do some kind of superhero movie review, and I will probably put up a poll for the $5 and up patrons to help pick that. So look forward to that, and thanks once again, everybody, for being here. I was Captain Logan, and Brandon, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
It's kind of an unusual way to do this, but it was fun bouncing stuff off of you. And I actually didn't go any longer than I usually do, which was shocking.
Your friend in the nick of time.
I'm glad you were here, because there were a few things that you were able to clarify for me, and it's also really fun to argue with you about things in Back to the Future.
I enjoy talking about this movie so much.
And it probably won't be the last time.
It's guaranteed to not be the last time.
We'll see you later, folks. I was Captain Logan. Once again, Brandon Graham. Bye guys.